Chapter 4: Social Influence and Group Dynamics Traps. You consider yourself an independent thinker, someone who makes decisions based on facts, personal values, and rational analysis. Someone who wouldn't be swayed by social pressure or manipulated into actions that contradict your better judgment. Most of us share this self-perception. We see ourselves as autonomous agents who think and act according to our own internal compass. But what if this perception is largely an illusion? What if our thoughts, decisions, and behaviors are profoundly shaped by social forces that operate beneath our awareness? What if even the most independent-minded among us are vulnerable to group influences that can lead us astray? The truth is that humans are inherently social creatures. Our brains evolved in tribal contexts where group acceptance meant survival and rejection often meant death. This evolutionary heritage has left us exquisitely sensitive to social cues, group norms, and the implicit expectations of others. These influences don't just affect our behavior, they shape our perceptions, alter our judgments, and sometimes even override our personal values. What makes these social influences particularly powerful is that they often operate invisibly. We don't experience them as external pressures, but as our own thoughts and choices. We believe we're deciding freely when we're actually responding to subtle social dynamics that guide us toward conformity, compliance, or collective error. Understanding these hidden influences isn't just academically interesting, it's practically essential. When we recognize the social forces that shape our thinking, we can develop strategies to maintain intellectual independence while still benefiting from group wisdom. We can learn to distinguish between helpful social guidance and harmful group pressure, and we can create environments that harness the power of collaboration while avoiding the pitfalls of collective error. In this chapter, we'll explore 10 common traps in social influence and group dynamics, patterns that can lead even the smartest individuals and teams to make poor decisions, suppress dissent, or act against their own interests. These traps affect workplace teams, friend groups, organizations, and even entire societies. By understanding them, you'll gain insight into both your own vulnerability to social influence and how you might be inadvertently influencing others. Let's begin by examining one of the most insidious group dynamics, one that has been implicated in countless organizational failures and historical disasters. Mindtrap 37, Groupthink. Have you ever sat in a meeting where a questionable idea gained momentum and eventually became the group's decision, despite private reservations you and perhaps others held? Or maybe you've been part of a team that pursued a clearly flawed strategy because no one wanted to challenge the emerging consensus. If so, you've experienced groupthink, a phenomenon where the desire for harmony and conformity overrides realistic appraisal and critical thinking. Groupthink represents one of the most dangerous aspects of group decision-making. It occurs when members of a cohesive group become so concerned with maintaining consensus that they lose their ability to evaluate ideas critically. The pressure for unanimity overrides the motivation to realistically assess alternative courses of action, leading to defective decision-making processes and often disastrous outcomes. What makes groupthink particularly insidious is that it typically occurs in groups with high cohesion and strong leadership, precisely the kinds of teams we might expect to make good decisions. When team members like and identify with each other, they become reluctant to introduce tension by disagreeing. When they respect their leader, they hesitate to challenge that person's preferred direction. These positive social bonds, paradoxically, create the conditions for collective error. The symptoms of groupthink are numerous, but often subtle. Groups experiencing groupthink typically develop an illusion of invulnerability that encourages excessive optimism and risk-taking. They collectively rationalize away warnings that might challenge their assumptions. They maintain an unquestioned belief in the group's inherent morality, making ethical considerations seem unnecessary. They stereotype opponents or outside critics as too hostile or uninformed to warrant serious engagement. And perhaps most dangerously, they apply direct pressure to any member who expresses strong arguments against the group's stereotypes, illusions, or commitments. These dynamics create a situation where self-censorship becomes common. Members minimize their doubts and counter-arguments rather than disrupting the apparent consensus. The group develops an illusion of unanimity, with the silence of members interpreted as agreement. And often, self-appointed mind guards emerge who protect the group from information that might disrupt the comfortable consensus. The consequences of groupthink can be severe. It leads to incomplete surveys of alternatives, poor information search, selective bias in processing available information, failure to examine risks of the preferred choice, and failure to develop contingency plans. In organizational contexts, these deficiencies can result in failed products, wasted resources, damaged reputations, or even catastrophic accidents. To counter groupthink, leaders should actively encourage dissent, perhaps even assigning someone the role of devil's advocate to ensure critical evaluation of proposals. Groups should invite outside experts to provide fresh perspectives and challenge assumptions. Members should be encouraged to discuss the group's deliberations with trusted outsiders and report back these reactions. And most importantly, an atmosphere must be created where questioning and doubt are valued rather than suppressed, where the group's goal is not harmony but accuracy and effectiveness. Ready to master these thinking traps? Get the complete 100 Mind Traps bundle featuring the instant download of the full ebook, audiobook, executive summary, and FAQ. Your purchase supports our free content. Click the link in pinned comment to buy now. For those not ready for the full bundle, I also invite you to download the free executive summary of this book, which contains the key ideas and takeaways of each chapter. Studies show that engaging with content in multiple formats significantly enhances learning and retention. Click the link in the pinned to claim your free executive summary and maximize your learning potential. It's free for now, but it won't be forever, so make sure to grab it while you can. Mind Trap Bystander Effect. Imagine walking down a corridor at work and seeing smoke coming from under a door, or witnessing a colleague experiencing what appears to be a medical emergency, or noticing that an important deadline is about to be missed because of an overlooked detail. How quickly would you act in these situations? Your intuition might suggest that you'd respond immediately, but research and real-world observations reveal a counterintuitive truth. The more people present in such situations, the less likely any individual is to take action. This phenomenon, known as the bystander effect, represents one of the most robust findings in social psychology and one of the most troubling aspects of group behavior. The bystander effect occurs through several psychological mechanisms. First is diffusion of responsibility, the sense that the obligation to act is distributed among all present, reducing each person's individual responsibility. When many people witness a problem, each person feels less personally responsible for addressing it. Someone should do something replaces I should do something in our mental calculus. Second is pluralistic ignorance, the tendency to look to others for cues about how to interpret an ambiguous situation. If no one else appears concerned or is taking action, we often conclude that action isn't necessary, even in the face of evidence suggesting otherwise. We doubt our own interpretation and defer to the apparent consensus of the group. Third is evaluation apprehension, the fear of being judged negatively if we misinterpret the situation or respond inappropriately. We worry about embarrassing ourselves by overreacting or stepping outside social norms, especially when others aren't taking action. These mechanisms create a situation where everyone is waiting for someone else to make the first move, resulting in collective inaction even when individual action would be virtually certain. The more people present, the stronger these effects become, creating the paradoxical situation where increased bystanders leads to decreased likelihood of intervention. The bystander effect manifests in various contexts beyond emergency situations. In workplace settings, it appears when team members notice problems, but assume someone else will address them. In online environments, it emerges when many people see requests for help, but few respond. In organizational contexts, it surfaces when ethical issues are observed, but not reported, because everyone assumes someone else will speak up. The consequences of the bystander effect can range from minor inefficiencies to serious harm. Problems that could be easily addressed if caught early may escalate because no one takes initial action. Opportunities for intervention are missed because everyone is waiting for someone else to move first. And in extreme cases, people in genuine need may go without help despite being surrounded by potential helpers. To counter the bystander effect, recognize your susceptibility to diffusion of responsibility and consciously resist it. In emergency situations, directly assign responsibilities to specific individuals rather than making general requests for help. In organizational contexts, create clear accountability structures so problems don't fall into the gap between shared responsibilities. And perhaps most importantly, be willing to be the first to act. Your initiative can break the cycle of collective inaction and prompt others to follow your lead. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to Grow to the Top and activate notifications to receive more self-improvement tips that will supercharge your growth. And make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. It really helps the channel grow. Thank you for your support. Mindtrap 39, Social Loafing. Have you noticed that group projects often yield less impressive results than you might expect given the talents of the individuals involved? Or that when many people are assigned to a task, the total output sometimes seems less than what fewer people might have accomplished? These observations point to social loafing, the tendency for individuals to exert less effort when working collectively than they would if working alone. Social loafing represents one of the central paradoxes of collaborative work. Logic suggests that combining multiple people's efforts should produce better results than individual work. Yet in many situations, the opposite occurs. Individual contributions diminish when subsumed within a group effort, leading to underperformance relative to the group's potential. This phenomenon occurs through several psychological mechanisms. First is diffusion of responsibility. Similar to the bystander effect, individuals feel less personally accountable for outcomes when responsibility is shared across a group. The psychological pressure to perform well decreases when success or failure will be attributed to the collective rather than to any specific person. Second is reduced identifiability. When individual contributions are pooled or difficult to distinguish, people feel less personal connection to the output. The knowledge that your specific contribution won't be evaluated separately reduces motivation to excel. Third is motivation matching, the tendency to adjust effort based on perceptions of others' contributions. When you believe, correctly or incorrectly, that others aren't fully committed, you may reduce your own effort to avoid being exploited or to maintain equity of input. These mechanisms create a situation where the potential synergy of group work is undermined by psychological processes that reduce individual motivation and effort. The larger the group, the stronger these effects typically become, creating diminishing returns as more people are added to a collaborative task. Social loafing manifests in various contexts. In workplace teams, it appears when certain members consistently contribute less than their capacity while relying on others' efforts. In academic settings, it emerges in group projects where work distribution becomes imbalanced. In volunteer organizations, it surfaces when a small percentage of members perform the majority of necessary tasks. The consequences of social loafing extend beyond reduced productivity. It creates inequitable workloads that can breed resentment among those who maintain high effort. It wastes human potential by allowing capable individuals to underperform, and it can damage morale and group cohesion when members perceive effort disparities. To counter social loafing, make individual contributions identifiable and measurable whenever possible. Reduce group size to increase personal accountability and visibility of contributions. Create structures that recognize and reward individual effort within collective work, and foster a group culture that values equity of effort and mutual responsibility for outcomes. Mindtrap 40, Pluralistic Ignorance. Have you ever sat through a confusing presentation, looked around at nodding heads, and kept your questions to yourself because everyone else seemed to understand? Or perhaps you've had reservations about a group decision, but remained silent because no one else voiced concerns. These experiences reflect pluralistic ignorance, a situation where most or all members of a group privately reject a norm, opinion, or behavior, but go along with it because they incorrectly assume that most others accept it. Pluralistic ignorance creates a fascinating paradox. A group of individuals can collectively enforce an idea that none of them personally support. This happens because each person looks to others' public behavior for guidance while hiding their own private doubts. The result is a shared misconception about what the group actually believes, leading to collective action that contradicts the genuine preferences of the members. This phenomenon occurs through several psychological mechanisms. First is the natural tendency to look to others for social cues about appropriate behavior, especially in ambiguous situations. When everyone appears to accept something, we question our own divergent reactions rather than the apparent consensus. Second is impression management, the desire to present ourselves favorably to others. We fear that revealing our confusion, disagreement, or discomfort might make us appear ignorant, difficult, or socially inappropriate. So we suppress these reactions and conform to the perceived norm. Third is the false assumption that others' external behavior accurately reflects their internal states. We fail to recognize that they, like us, might be engaging in impression management rather than expressing genuine acceptance. These mechanisms create a situation where a group maintains a public consensus that privately no one supports. Each member thinks, "I don't really agree with this, but everyone else seems to, so I'll go along with it," not realizing that everyone else is thinking the same thing. Pluralistic ignorance manifests in various contexts. In educational settings, it appears when students don't ask questions because each assumes they're the only one confused. In organizational contexts, it emerges when team members silently implement directives they privately believe are misguided. In social situations, it surfaces when people engage in behaviors they personally dislike because they incorrectly believe others enjoy them. The consequences of pluralistic ignorance can be significant. It leads to the persistence of unpopular norms that no one actually supports. It prevents necessary questions and clarifications that would benefit everyone. It can result in collective decisions that no individual would choose if acting alone. And it creates a culture of inauthenticity where people routinely misrepresent their true thoughts and feelings. To counter pluralistic ignorance, create safe channels for anonymous feedback to reveal genuine private opinions. Normalize expressions of confusion, doubt, or disagreement by modeling these yourself. Explicitly check for understanding and invite questions rather than assuming silence indicates comprehension or agreement. And remember that others' apparent acceptance may be as superficial as your own. Their nodding heads might conceal the same doubts you're experiencing. Mind Trap 41, Bandwagon Effect Herd Mentality. Why do certain investments suddenly attract floods of capital despite unchanged fundamentals? Why do organizational initiatives sometimes gain momentum regardless of their actual merit? Why do social media platforms periodically erupt with enthusiasm for new trends? These phenomena reflect the bandwagon effect, our tendency to adopt beliefs, ideas, or behaviors simply because many others have done so. The bandwagon effect represents one of the most pervasive forms of social influence. It operates on the principle that the probability of any individual adopting an idea increases with the proportion of others who have already done so. As something gains popularity, it becomes increasingly likely that additional people will join the trend, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of adoption that can spread rapidly through social networks. This phenomenon occurs through several psychological mechanisms. First is social proof, the tendency to view a behavior as correct to the extent that we see others performing it. When many people adopt something, we assume they must have good reasons, even if we don't know what those reasons are. Second is fear of missing out, FOMO, the anxiety that we might miss valuable opportunities or experiences if we don't join the trend. As adoption increases, so does the perceived cost of non-participation. Third is the desire for social acceptance and belonging. Adopting popular beliefs or behaviors helps us feel connected to others and integrated within our social groups. These mechanisms create a situation where popularity itself becomes a reason for adoption, independent of objective merit. The more people join the bandwagon, the stronger the social pressure becomes for others to follow, potentially leading to widespread adoption of ideas or behaviors that individuals might reject if considering them independently. The bandwagon effect manifests in various contexts. In financial markets, it appears as investment bubbles where assets are purchased primarily because others are buying them. In organizational settings, it emerges when initiatives gain support based on perceived popularity rather than demonstrated effectiveness. In consumer contexts, it surfaces as fads and trends that spread rapidly through social influence. The consequences of the bandwagon effect can be significant. It can lead to poor decision-making when social influence overrides critical evaluation. It can create market inefficiencies when prices reflect popularity rather than fundamental value. It can waste organizational resources on initiatives that lack substantive merit but have gained momentum through social contagion. And it can undermine individual autonomy when people adopt beliefs or behaviors that don't align with their genuine preferences or interests. To counter the bandwagon effect, deliberately separate the popularity of an idea from its actual merits. Ask yourself, would I adopt this if I were the only one doing so? Seek diverse information sources rather than relying solely on what's currently popular. And remember that widespread adoption doesn't necessarily indicate quality or suitability. Sometimes the bandwagon is heading in the wrong direction. Mindtrap 42, Authority Bias, Obedience Effect. Why do smart, ethical people sometimes implement directives they privately question? Why do organizations occasionally pursue strategies that many members privately doubt? Why do capable professionals sometimes defer to the judgment of authorities even when their own expertise suggests a different approach? These behaviors reflect authority bias, our tendency to attribute greater accuracy, knowledge, and wisdom to the opinions of authority figures and to comply with their directives, even when doing so conflicts with our personal judgment. Authority bias represents one of the most powerful forms of social influence. It operates on the principle that deference to legitimate authorities is generally adaptive. Authorities typically possess greater knowledge, experience, or perspective that makes their guidance valuable. However, this generally adaptive tendency can become problematic when it leads to uncritical acceptance of an authority's views or directives, regardless of their actual merit. This bias occurs through several psychological mechanisms. First is the assumption of superior knowledge. We tend to believe that those in positions of authority must possess special expertise or information that justifies their status and opinions. Second is the diffusion of responsibility. Following an authority's directives allows us to attribute responsibility for outcomes to the authority rather than to ourselves. I was just following orders becomes an internal as well as external justification. Third is the power of hierarchical structures and symbols. Titles, uniforms, credentials, and other symbols of authority trigger automatic deference responses that can bypass critical thinking. These mechanisms create a situation where the mere perception of legitimate authority can induce compliance with requests or acceptance of opinions that individuals might otherwise reject. The stronger the authority symbols and the more established the hierarchical structure, the more powerful this effect becomes. Authority bias manifests in various contexts. In organizational settings, it appears when employees implement directives they privately question because they come from senior leadership. In professional contexts, it emerges when practitioners defer to established authorities despite contradictory evidence. In consumer contexts, it surfaces when purchasing decisions are influenced by endorsements from perceived authorities. The consequences of authority bias can be significant. It can lead to the implementation of flawed strategies when critical feedback is suppressed due to the source of the strategy. It can create ethical breaches when individuals follow problematic directives rather than questioning authority. It can waste resources on initiatives that lack merit but are protected by authoritative support. And it can undermine innovation when established authorities reject novel approaches without adequate consideration. To counter authority bias, evaluate ideas based on their merit rather than their source. Remember that expertise is domain-specific. Authority in one area doesn't confer authority in others. Create organizational cultures that value upward feedback and questioning of authority. And recognize that legitimate authorities can make mistakes or have blind spots. Respectful skepticism is not the same as disrespect. Mind Trap 43, Conformity, Peer Pressure. Why do we sometimes find ourselves agreeing with group opinions we privately question? Why might we adopt behaviors that don't align with our personal preferences? Why do we occasionally remain silent when we have relevant information that contradicts the group's perspective? These behaviors reflect conformity, our tendency to align our attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors with perceived group norms, often at the expense of our independent judgment. Conformity represents one of the most fundamental forms of social influence. It operates on the principle that social acceptance is a primary human need, and deviation from group norms risks rejection or marginalization. This creates powerful pressure to suppress individual differences and adopt the positions or behaviors that appear to be endorsed by the majority. This phenomenon occurs through several psychological mechanisms. First is normative influence, the desire to be accepted and avoid social disapproval. We conform to be liked and included, even when we privately disagree with the group's position. Second is informational influence, the tendency to look to others for guidance about what is correct, especially in ambiguous situations. When uncertain, we often assume that the group has better information than we do individually. Third is the desire for cognitive consistency. Maintaining views that differ from our social group creates uncomfortable cognitive dissonance, which we can resolve by bringing our opinions into alignment with the group. These mechanisms create a situation where social pressure can override independent judgment, leading individuals to publicly endorse positions they privately question or engage in behaviors that don't reflect their personal preferences. The more unanimous the group appears, and the more important group membership is to the individual, the stronger these pressures become. Conformity manifests in various contexts. In workplace settings, it appears when team members withhold dissenting viewpoints to maintain harmony. In social contexts, it emerges when individuals adopt group behaviors that contradict their personal values. In decision-making contexts, it surfaces when people support consensus positions despite private reservations. The consequences of conformity can be significant. It can lead to poor decisions when critical perspectives are suppressed for the sake of agreement. It can create personal distress when individuals act against their authentic preferences to fit in. It can stifle innovation when unconventional ideas are withheld due to fear of social disapproval. And it can facilitate harmful group behaviors when individuals conform to destructive norms rather than challenging them. To counter conformity pressures, strengthen your commitment to personal values before entering group situations. Seek out environments that encourage diverse perspectives rather than demanding consensus. Find at least one ally before voicing dissent in group settings. And remember that authentic self-expression, while sometimes socially risky in the short term, builds more meaningful connections and contributions in the long run. Mind Trap 44, Group Polarization. Have you ever noticed that after a group discussion, the collective position often becomes more extreme than the average of individual positions beforehand? Or that teams sometimes adopt riskier strategies than any individual member would recommend? Or that groups with a particular leaning tend to become more strongly committed to that position over time? These phenomena reflect group polarization, the tendency for groups to make more extreme decisions in the direction of the initial inclination than individuals would make alone. Group polarization represents one of the most counterintuitive aspects of group dynamics. Logic might suggest that group discussion would moderate extreme positions and lead to compromise. Instead, The opposite typically occurs. Discussion among like-minded individuals intensifies their pre-existing tendencies, pushing the collective position toward greater extremity. This phenomenon occurs through several psychological mechanisms. First is persuasive arguments theory. During discussion, group members are exposed to a larger pool of arguments supporting the initially preferred position, strengthening that preference through additional rationales. Second is social comparison theory. Individuals want to be perceived favorably by the group, which in many contexts means being slightly more committed to the group's values than average. This creates a dynamic where members try to position themselves on the correct side of the perceived norm. Third is confirmation bias in a social context. Groups tend to spend more time discussing information that supports their initial leaning, while giving less attention to contradictory information, creating an imbalanced consideration of evidence. These mechanisms create a situation where groups with a particular inclination become more extreme in that direction through interaction rather than moderating toward the center. The more homogeneous the initial positions and the more isolated the group is from opposing viewpoints, the stronger this effect becomes. Group polarization manifests in various contexts. In political settings, it appears when ideologically similar groups become increasingly extreme through internal discussion. In organizational contexts, it emerges when teams make riskier or more conservative decisions than individual members would support. In online communities, it surfaces when echo chambers intensify shared perspectives without exposure to alternative viewpoints. The consequences of group polarization can be significant. It can lead to extreme decisions that fail to consider moderate alternatives or opposing perspectives. It can create unnecessary conflict when polarized groups encounter each other after becoming more extreme. It can reduce the quality of decision-making by limiting consideration of diverse viewpoints. And it can contribute to social division when different groups move toward increasingly incompatible positions. To counter group polarization, deliberately include diverse perspectives in group discussions. Assign someone to play devil's advocate even when genuine disagreement is absent. Consider alternatives and counter-arguments explicitly rather than focusing exclusively on preferred positions. And maintain connections with individuals or groups who hold different viewpoints to prevent isolation in like-minded echo chambers. Mindtrap 45, Abilene Paradox. Imagine a group unanimously deciding to pursue a course of action that, as it later turns out, no individual actually wanted. Each person went along with the apparent consensus, assuming others genuinely supported the decision, while privately harboring doubts or outright opposition. This perplexing scenario illustrates the Abilene paradox, a situation where a group takes action contrary to the genuine preferences of its members because each person misperceives the collective will. The Abilene paradox represents one of the strangest aspects of group dynamics. Unlike many group decision problems that stem from disagreement or conflict, this paradox emerges from a failure of communication that creates false agreement. The group reaches consensus not because members truly agree, but because each person misreads others' preferences and suppresses their own contrary views. This phenomenon occurs through several psychological mechanisms. First is pluralistic ignorance. Each person incorrectly assumes that their private reservations are not shared by others, leading them to conform to what they perceive as the majority view. Second is fear of negative evaluation. Individuals worry that expressing opposition might make them appear uncooperative, negative, or disruptive, so they withhold their true preferences. Third is the assumption of others' positive support. When people express lukewarm or ambiguous agreement, we tend to interpret this as genuine enthusiasm rather than reluctant compliance. These mechanisms create a situation where a group can unanimously endorse a decision that no member actually supports. Each person thinks, I don't really want this, but everyone else seems to, so I'll go along with it, not realizing that everyone else is thinking the same thing. The Abilene paradox manifests in various contexts. In organizational settings, it appears when teams implement initiatives that no one privately supports because each assumes others are in favor. In social contexts, it emerges when groups engage in activities that no individual would have chosen. In decision-making contexts, it surfaces when collective choices contradict the genuine preferences of all members. The consequences of the Abilene paradox can be significant. It leads to wasted resources on initiatives that lack genuine support. It creates frustration and disillusionment when group members later discover the unnecessary nature of their collective action. It damages trust when people realize they've been misled by others' false agreement. And it establishes patterns of inauthentic communication that can persist beyond the initial decision. To counter the Abilene paradox, create safe channels for expressing genuine preferences without fear of social disapproval. Use anonymous polling or written feedback before discussion to reveal true opinions. Check for authentic agreement rather than assuming silence indicates support, and cultivate an environment where honest dissent is valued as a contribution rather than viewed as disruption. Mind Trap 46, Tragedy of the Commons. Why do shared resources often become depleted despite everyone's interest in their preservation? Why might team members overuse common supplies or facilities even when this ultimately harms everyone? Why do collective assets frequently suffer from neglect when individual possessions are well maintained? These patterns reflect the tragedy of the commons, a situation where individuals, acting according to their self-interest, deplete a shared limited resource, even when it's clear that this outcome serves no one's long-term interests. The tragedy of the commons represents one of the most persistent dilemmas in collective action. It occurs when multiple individuals have access to a limited resource and each pursues their maximum individual benefit without considering the aggregate impact of these actions. The rational pursuit of self-interest by each person leads to an outcome that makes everyone worse off, a genuine tragedy of collective action. This phenomenon occurs through several psychological and structural mechanisms. First is the incentive structure itself. Individuals receive the full benefit of their resource use, while the costs are distributed across all users, creating a situation where the rational choice for each person leads to collective disaster. Second is temporal discounting. The immediate benefits of resource use are concrete and certain, while the long-term costs of depletion are abstract and distant, leading people to prioritize present gains over future sustainability. Third is diffusion of responsibility. When many people share access to a resource, each feels less personally responsible for its maintenance or conservation. Someone else will take care of it becomes an implicit assumption that ultimately leaves the resource unprotected. These mechanisms create a situation where individual rationality leads to collective irrationality, a genuine social dilemma where what makes sense for each person creates an outcome that serves no one's interests. The tragedy of the commons manifests in various contexts. In environmental settings, it appears as the depletion of natural resources when individual users extract maximum benefit without considering sustainability. In organizational contexts, it emerges when shared resources like meeting rooms, equipment, or staff time are overused by departments pursuing their individual goals. In community settings, it surfaces when public spaces or facilities deteriorate because maintenance responsibility is diffused. The consequences of this dynamic can be severe. It can lead to the complete depletion of valuable resources that could have sustained everyone if properly managed. It creates inefficiencies when overuse reduces the resource's value for all users. It generates conflict as users compete for dwindling resources, and it establishes patterns of short-term thinking that can be difficult to reverse even when the collective harm becomes apparent. To counter the tragedy of the commons, establish clear governance systems for shared resources with explicit usage rights and limitations. Create monitoring mechanisms that make resource use visible and attributable. Develop graduated sanctions for overuse that align individual incentives with collective welfare. And foster communication among resource users to build trust and facilitate coordination around sustainable practices. The power and peril of group influence. As we've explored these 10 social influence and group dynamics traps, a consistent theme emerges. Our thoughts, decisions, and behaviors are profoundly shaped by social forces that often operate outside our awareness. From the subtle pressure to conform to the complex dynamics of collective action problems, these influences can lead even the most intelligent individuals and groups astray. Understanding these patterns doesn't mean we should avoid groups or reject social influence entirely. Human collaboration has produced our greatest achievements, and social learning is an essential aspect of our cognitive toolkit. The goal isn't to eliminate social influence, but to become more conscious of it, to distinguish between helpful social guidance and harmful group pressure, between productive collaboration and counterproductive conformity. By recognizing these dynamics, we gain the power to design better group processes, to contribute more effectively to collective decisions, and to maintain our intellectual autonomy even while benefiting from the wisdom of others. We can create environments that harness the power of collaboration while avoiding the pitfalls of groupthink, conformity, and other collective traps. The biases we've examined in this chapter affect how we think and act in social contexts. But what about the fundamental judgments and decisions we make as individuals? How do our minds process information, evaluate options, and reach conclusions, even when we're not directly influenced by others? In the next chapter, we'll explore the fascinating world of decision-making biases and heuristics, the mental shortcuts that help us navigate a complex world but can sometimes lead us dramatically astray, causing us to misperceive risks, overvalue certain types of information, and cling to decisions that no longer serve us. Tap the center of the video now to continue your transformation journey.